first session is an overview on Swaraj and Sarvodaya. We have two friends, two speakers anchoring that whole exploration for the morning, which will be basically Manoj and Ganesh ji. Manoj Pavitran, that's his full name, a production engineer by training. He's from Kerala, from Thrissur, near Thrissur, and production engineer by training. Then he also studied product design at NIT way back in 1989. Yeah. And he is inspired by integral yoga, and he's been a student of integral yoga since 1989 or so. He moved to Oroville in 95, about 25 years ago, and he's been living here since then. And his interests include education, filmmaking. He's made some very good films, very interesting films on Sri Aurobindo and integral yoga. So his interests include education, filmmaking, and also software design. So he's also part of a unit called Sopanam, which works on films, also Talam, which works on software design, and he's also part of the ACI, the Oroville Campus Initiative, which is the host for the 2 days, and he's also part of this hugely successful program called Swadharma, which works with young people in helping them discover their calling in life. And there's an interesting program they run. So Manoj is also one of the architects of that program.
Naveen touched upon as the country and as the world is sinking into increasing chaos and confusion. It's natural that a deep prayer arises. And often these moments of crisis also turn out to be moments of awakening and also moments of reaffirming the deeper truth of our being that comes forward to deal with the emerging crisis. A young man in 1893 came upon such a crisis or a challenge. On June 7th, he was thrown out of a train in South Africa. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. That incident shook him. That's when the fire was kindled. And he decided to fight against racial discrimination and fight for the civil rights of the people. And interestingly, the same year, 2 other incidents started. To me, this year, 1893, is critically important in Indian history. The other 2 events. That happened within 3 weeks after Gandhiji was thrown out of the train. It was June 7th and June 29th. A young man of age 21, he wrote in Hindu Prakash, a daily, his first essay called India and the British Parliament, where he was setting the tone of India having to stand for her own freedom and expecting justice from the British government, crying like a baby, asking for privileges. That's not going to help. India has to really stand up. And that was Sri Aurobindo. he had returned from England the same year, 1893. And he was beginning his political action. And that was his first essay. Third event, it is the same year, the eldest of them all, he was 30 years old. He sails from India to Chicago, and on 11th September, he makes his world famous speech. Swami Vivekananda. And all these three began in 1893 within a span of three months. And these are like seeds of a major change that was coming up. When we look at these events, not as an isolated incidents, but from the perspective of the larger time spirit or the soul of India beginning to act through her chosen instruments, we see a beginning of a pattern. And that year, Swami Vivekananda lays or opened the doors and plants the seeds of India's future mission. And Sri Aurobindo begins his work and Gandhiji starts his work. I'm not a scholar in Gandhiji's works. I know more about Sri Aurobindo's works. And so I will be focusing on Sri Aurobindo's journey, how he took it forward, and what was unfolding for him, what he saw, and how he engaged with the problems that were arising. When he started writing, there was a historical context in India at that time. Indian National Congress was already 8 years old. 1885, Indian National Congress was formed. And Congress had been largely satisfied with debates and resolutions asking for more privileges and inclusion of Indians in the parliamentary process. But till that point, no one really dared to ask for India's freedom, that India can stand on her own. The idea of Swaraj was already planted by Swami Dayananda Saraswati, and there were few sparks here and there, but there was no political organization that took that up and demanded the freedom for the country. And Congress was unwilling at that time. They thought the British rule was necessary at that point of time. India was not ready. And to be part of that empire was better for India. What we can do was ask for more inclusion and more justice for the people. And here is one of the fundamental difference between, say, Gandhiji and Sri Aurobindo. When Gandhiji began his work, his stance was also in a similar way, that British rule at this point of time is not to be challenged. What we can look for was inclusion, more justice, and fighting against the discrimination. Whereas Sri Aurobindo was taking a very radical stand. And there was a series of articles he wrote in Hindu Prakash, which was harshly criticizing the approach of Indian National Congress at that time. and saying that we must stand for ourselves. Expecting justice is not going to work. And his criticism was so direct. The leaders of that time was troubled. They were worried that there will be sedition case against. So there was pressure on him to tone down and be more neutral. Soon he lost interest in those series that he was writing. It was called New Lamps for the Old. Symbolically, he was speaking about bringing a new light, new leadership, new vision, new courage. But it was too scary at that time. So the publisher was under pressure, and he had to tone down, and he eventually stops. And then he moves more, preparing of the ground for freedom. And he saw that there was 3 areas of work. One was preparing a revolutionary movement demanding freedom. Second was setting the will for freedom in the country, because that idea itself was not collectively owned, felt. And third was the need for a political organization that stands up for it and demands it. All 3 were missing, and he wanted to work on that. And these were the 3 areas in which he began the work, preparing the ground. He was working with Baroda King at that time. So even when his essays that when he published early on, it was not published with his name. And it was characteristics of his approach. He was always operating from behind, largely invisible. And he will remain invisible till 1907 or 6. I will come to that. So when he began this process, silently, he was also aligning with the leaders of that time, and he found great ally in Tilak and Bipin Chandra Pal. They were all closely connected. And Sri Aurobindo was training people. There was the movement of revolutionary preparation in Bengal. Jatin Banerjee was trained in Baroda army, and he was sent to Bengal to prepare the ground. And Sri Aurobindo's own brother was preparing a large-scale movement, but he was behind the scene. And he was also concerned about national education at that time. India's education system was extremely poor, and he laid great stress on education, and he himself became a faculty member in Baroda College, later its vice principal. And the threshold came when the Bengal was divided in 1905. Till that period, when he was in Baroda, he was preparing and he was diving deep into Indian culture, learning Sanskrit, going through Indian literature, rediscovering his own roots, reclaiming his own deepest yearning, deepest strength, deepest light that this nation had to offer. So he was diving deep into his own study of Indian culture, and at the same time preparing India. And he was trying to get the Congress to accept Swaraj as a choice, as an objective for the nation. And he was persuading youth from Bengal to come under the leadership of Tilak and claim this stand in Congress. And this is the point where there was this tension building up in Congress. There was moderates who wanted a softer approach, and there was nationalists who wanted India must be free. And it was in 1906, first time these ideals were accepted. Swaraj, Swadeshi, boycott, national education, all these were accepted by the Congress in 1906. But again, the division between the leaders was so deep, there was attempts to reverse it. And this erupted into a great crisis in Congress in 1907, Surat Congress. That's where the split became very obvious, and there was massive chaos. And the nationalists were pushing forward for their agenda, and Congress splits. And behind it, Sri Aurobindo was working towards establishing the idea of first, India must be free as a sovereign nation. And second, Congress itself as a political organ that can claim that and engage in the political action, which Congress was unwilling till that point of time. And parallel to that, he was writing. Bipin Chandra Pal started Vande Mataram a year before. And that's where, again, Sri Aurobindo was extensively writing. And Sri Aurobindo gave great importance to Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who wrote Vande Mataram. And he saw that the Vande Mataram, that phrase, gave the nation the vision of the nation as the mother, the divine Shakti who was awakening. And that was the mantra. And for finding that mantra, he called Bankim Chandra Chatterjee a rishi. And that mantra, Tagore set to a tune in one of the Congress meetings, and that became the cry for freedom. And it was stirring through the hearts of the people. And the partition of the Bengal was the turning point. And revolutionary movements were erupting across the country. And Vande Mataram was ringing through the nation, and the fire for the aspiration, the will for freedom was becoming stronger and stronger. And it was establishing firmly in the heart of the people, and that's the point where Congress splits. In order to establish that, he saw that it was a necessary sacrifice to establish this will for freedom, even if it arrests all the leaders of the country. And direct consequence was that Tilak was arrested, put into jail. And Sri Aurobindo himself was arrested, but they couldn't find any evidence, and they had to let him go. But they knew this man is dangerous, you have to catch him. And that's the point when suddenly he burst out in the public space. He became visible. Even in Vande Mataram time, he was writing without giving his name. He was writing without revealing who it was behind. But with his arrest, he became visible. And soon, he will be again arrested in 1908, and he will spend a year in the jail And 1908 turned out to be a major turning point for Sri Aurobindo. That's the year when he first had the experience of nirvana. He met Vishnu Bhaskar Lele, and with his guidance, he could silence his mind, and within 3 days, he could enter a state of nirvana. A deeply silent mind, a blank void engulfed him. And he was in the middle of political activity. And he told Lele, look, there is nothing in me anymore. I can't go and give a talk. But Lele said, you go, do a pranam. Speech will happen. And he did, and that exactly is what happened. He became a walking, talking nirvana. That ego was dissolved. His being was opening to vasta, empty, void. Yet there was a presence that was growing, that was speaking through him, guiding him, leading his life, and taking charge of the situation. And when he was arrested, he was troubled. Why he was arrested? He had a great mission for the country, and he thought he was led by that inner guide. But why? Why he was arrested? And in the jail he began the sadhana of Gita. And interestingly, Tilak was also practicing the sadhana of the Gita, and Tilak wrote Gita Rahasyam during that period, while Sri Aurobindo was doing his sadhana in the jail. Vasudeva Sarvamiti. All this is Vasudeva. That was his mantra, and he was concentrating on that. And he arrives at that experience of the immanent divine, everything in creation as that divine presence permeating, engulfing. And behind all this, the jailer, the jail, the walls, the mattress, everything was that. These two experiences that happened in 1908 were central to Sri Aurobindo's yoga. And it is in the jail he found his greater mission. His initial idea was that he took up yoga practice in 1904 in order to gain the yoga shakti to liberate the country. But soon he realized independence of India was a condition, a step towards a greater challenge that humanity was heading for. He saw that humanity was heading for an evolutionary crisis. The evolution of the mind had reached a peak where the system of civilization it was creating, a mechanized civilization, which Gandhiji later calls civilization as a satanic civilization. He was seeing that evolutionary stage has reached a point where a breakdown is imminent. It's inevitable if we continue the same way. And this crisis can be met only in a revolution in consciousness. Consciousness that is beyond mind has to come to deal with it. And mind and its intelligence, the age of reason was coming to an end. It cannot go further with its own limited light. We need something vaster and greater than reason. That exploration that took place in the jail, where he had received guidance from Swami Vivekananda, who had already passed away in 1902. And Swami Vivekananda's guidance he was receiving in the jail, and he was exploring the worlds beyond the physical, the dimensions that were beyond the physical, the subtler planes. And he comes across what he referred to as supermind, a new range of consciousness, which was known to the Vedic rishis, but the knowledge of it was lost. And he saw that the human crisis that was unfolding on the planet was secretly a preparation for the manifestation of that higher level of possibility in humanity. And mind was at a peak. And it has to transcend its own possibilities to a higher level of consciousness. And he saw that his mission was this. India's freedom was a step on the way. His work was for the humanity, the whole planet. He referred to as earth consciousness was in crisis. And India has the key. India has the knowledge. India can give to the world. And it is for that India's freedom becomes so central. India's Swaraj becomes so central. And for him, Sarvodaya, he never used the word Sarvodaya, by the way. He used the term collective evolution. He saw that the evolutionary crisis that we are in is also a crisis in disguise, where there is a greater awakening into this new consciousness that is about to manifest on earth. And his work was to enable that to happen. And he also saw that this has a long, long historic context. Very, very ancient historic process. A mission that India had taken up or was given to India. For thousands of years, it had been unfolding layer by layer. And he gave that brief overview of that process in one of his letters, where he said, behind the mental evolution that we, humanity, at that point of time was going through, there was a very ancient process which had two lines of development. One was the discovery of the occult processes, the other was discovery of the soul in man. And he said, civilizations like Atlantis, we only have stories about that, were the one who went in the occult dimension, whereas in India, it took the other direction, which was realization of the soul within and the planes of consciousness above. And the Vedic age, in his experience, was the time when this was lived from an intuitive consciousness. Intuition, the age of intuition came first in India. And that too, he says, there was a pre-Vedic time where this higher consciousness was known and explored, which was lost. And Vedic time was a rapid recapturing of that, the time of the rishis. When we read the Vedas, we can hear that the rishis talking about the Purve Virishi Virityo, the earlier rishis. And that discovery, the Vedic rishis' discovery, still remains as that seed from which the unfolding was happening. And Indian civilization went through many, many layers with a very clear, progressive unfolding. So what he was discovering was that there was this ascent into this higher consciousness, discovery of Mahas or Vijnana or supermind in the early days, and then there was a downward movement of consciousness where every layer of consciousness was taken up and worked on over thousands of years. So after the age of intuition came the intellectual age, a massive mental development. So putting the spiritual experience in terms of the mind, the spirit in the mind was the next stage. So we can see from the Vedas, there is a period of Upanishads, and early Upanishads were closer to the Vedic, and the later Upanishads were increasingly becoming intellectually sophisticated, whereas Vedic imagery, Vedic approach, Vedic consciousness was quite different. Then came period of Buddha and the period of an incredible flowering of intellectual articulation and expression of spiritual experience and knowledge. So that was a descending movement, and we see the Ashtanga Yoga, Ashtanga Hridaya, all the Eightfold Noble Path, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, all that unfolding, and classic period of India unfolds. And in that classic period, further, there is a downward movement. From intellectual development, slowly it takes up the emotional being and turns it towards the Godhead, the divine. And all the bhakti movements, and the bhakti itself, that turning of emotion towards the divine, started spreading across the country. And there were many such movements happening. And further, it went further down into Puranic and Tantric time, where the will in life, will of mind, will to conquer nature. And Tantra takes on that, the will and sensuality, senses. So it was a downward movement into various layers of consciousness. And embracing totality of life with that spiritualizing of it, including the senses, sensory enjoyment, sensory involvement, the world at large, mastering of the world and the powers of the world. And then further, it goes down into the physical. The Hatha Yoga emerged. So it was a descending movement downward all the way towards the Hatha Yogic. And at that period of time, there was a loss of India's direction. And meanwhile, as a political formation, India was undergoing rapid changes. From early republics to empires, and from empires to invasions, and eventually the last 1,000 years, a slow decline, an arrest of progress. In 17th and 18th century, there was a rapid disintegration of Indian civilization and loss of direction and complete darkness pervading the country. And the work that was to reach into the physical and the characteristic powers required to deal with the physical was not touched at all. And that cycle is where the new seeds were getting, the new beginning was to emerge. So we have a similar thing happening in the western side, where cycles were shorter, where we have pre-Greek civilization, the age of mysteries. Then there was a Greek period where there was amazing intellectual development. From there, falling into the Roman Empire period, the will, but a rapid disintegration from there and falling into the medieval darkness. But then from that darkness, science arising from the physical, basing itself on reason and sensory verifiable truth. And with that empowered new knowledge, of which Europe was the protagonist, was spreading across the world. And India came under that steamroller. And India was waking up from the slumber into which India had fallen. And Sri Aurobindo saw that his work is at this junction where that age of reason and mental ability to deal with the complexity will come to a crisis. And we need that higher consciousness from which the Indian civilization began its journey. And he saw that the work of India had three things. One is to rediscover that spiritual splendor, that capacity, experience. Second was to re-articulate it, give it new forms in contemporary terms. Third was to deal with the modern problems from that light. And he himself was pioneering that work. So he came out of the jail, he started Karma Yoga and Dharma, two publications, where he was bringing in a whole new perspective. But soon again, he was about to be arrested, and he was informed by Sister Nivedita that he will be arrested. So at that time, he leaves British India and come to Pondicherry. And his idea at that time was he would do his sadhana, establish this higher consciousness, and go back. But he never went back. The work of establishing that new consciousness on earth became his lifelong work. It was joined by the mother in 1914. And for him, Swaraj was first of all realizing that in a vast being that is within us. And it was not enough. He said we need to become that universal being that embraces the world. And it is only on that foundation of our universal being, a new creation, a new world can emerge. The limited light of reason is insufficient. Then comes the two tensions. One is the individual who liberates, the other is the collective. Harmonizing the individual and the collective. A coherence at the collective level and freedom at the individual level. These are ancient enemies. They don't go together. And this can be accomplished only by establishing ourselves in that deeper foundation of that vaster freedom. And for that, he was developing integral yoga, where he was taking up that entire civilizational cycle, all that knowledge India had gathered across thousands of years. The Vedic wisdom, the Upanishadic wisdom, the Sankhyas, the Vedanta, the Buddhist wisdom, the Tantric wisdom, Puranic wisdom, all that, and synthesizing, and various yogic schools, he was synthesizing all that knowledge and bringing in the essence of it, and to accelerate the process of evolution. This work continued over many decades. Even that new articulation of the ancient wisdom in his series that he began in Arya in 1914, where he starts with the secrets of the Veda, the life divine, the synthesis of yoga, where he took up even the Western philosophies, all that visions of the world and the progress, integrates that with the Indian wisdom of the spiritual progress, the spiritual evolution on the planet, and put forward his new vision of the world, where there is a whole new creation arising based on a deeper spiritual truth, of which we are witnessing a destruction of the old civilization, the old ways of doing, limitations of our instrument. Now, in today's world, we can see that the limitations of the mind has become so obvious. Something other than mind is required. Now, that work, for which he saw that there is going to be a free grouping of mankind, a collective sadhana. Ancient Indian polity had this seed in its social organization, the self-governing collectives, communities, that was free to evolve in its own way, define its own culture, define its own process. The new emergence that is happening across the world, where beyond the nation states, a global governance is emerging, and a community of nations are emerging, and within nations, self-governing communities are to emerge. And as a prototype, he saw Deva Sangha, a divine collective, a collective that dedicates itself to realization of this higher consciousness, not only at an individual level but at a collective level. And what it means to surrender as individuals and to become a collective being, a group soul, to discover the nation soul. And this became the major work which he described in detail in major works, in collected works, we can see that. And Auroville is one of the prototypes. Mother initiated Auroville in order to realize this deeper vision, where we have to go beyond mind. A new type of social organization, new type of political organization, economic organization, new type of educational system. All these are required. And she mentioned that India has become the place where all the difficulties of the world are concentrated, and it will be in India the solution will be found. And it is for that these experiments, these prototypes are unfolding. So that's just an overview of his work, his vision, and the processes that are unfolding. And in order to understand what's happening in the world, we need a framework that is large enough to see the place of each and everything, an integral knowledge, an integral framework, an integral process, where individual can align with the force that is vast enough to embrace the totality and unfold India's mission, India's work, and India has the key. So India's Swaraj and India's collective awakening, if it is not aligned with that, we are missing the line of very ancient cycle of unfolding. It's a completion of an ancient process where this new range, what Sri Aurobindo called supermind, is manifesting. Something that is way beyond mind and reason. And we are entering into age, a spiritual age, of which we are in the middle of a transformational chaos and crisis. But when we see that where we are heading and the process, the practice that is given to us or that is discovered and developed, then the path becomes visible, how to navigate individually and collectively. With that, I would like to end my sharing and open to a few questions.
Thank you with my and our heart, Manoj. So many deep themes that you have offered, just in a sense of realization, I just wish to share one or two themes. That in this very deep journey of many-sided histories and realizations of the present, for example, your story about the pre-Vedic and Vedic. Now, India also from the beginning has been part of a world, and therefore India has been in a deep and many-sided cross-cultural interaction and learning. And in the West also, when you said that the pre-Greek, Greek, and the Dark Age, and the revival of science, but what made that possible is the fact that Islamic civilization had stored it. And that points to a deep reality of a cross-cultural, ever-present, and maybe as a hidden remnant. So I just want to bring this dimension to our collective realization that both India and the West have been transcultural in terms of interaction, and it is the beauty of Sri Aurobindo also to embody that, the synthesis that you are pointing to, and you have hinted at that. Sri Aurobindo's synthesis also, the many strands of the India, and also synthesis with the West, and also many dimensions of the West, both the romantic and the Western.
Sri Aurobindo has hinted pre-Vedic civilization. Mother has also spoken about it. We do not have sufficient research to know that, and that period, according to him, there was something that is universal. It was not a regional thing. There was a global, very, very ancient culture, of which what we have are remnants and pockets, reconnecting and rediscovering. We need a lot more research to rediscover that source of which all of us are. Various streams, various nations and various cultures are streams carrying the memory in different ways and now coming together.
Okay, wonderful. My name is Srinivas. Thank you for a very illuminating lecture. To carry on with the same question, would it be accurate to say that the pre-Vedic civilization was a more nature-based way of living, because you find that as the obvious evolution of humanity, that we were more natural beings living much close to nature. Maybe we had hopped off the trees, but just about around that time. Would it be accurate to say that it was a tantric civilization? Would that be the right characterization? And would it be like, for example, if you go to the Greeks and all that, you find like in Europe you'll find the Celtics, and then if you go to South America you will find the very similar types of thought streams. This question.
We do not have much archaeological evidence or historical evidence of the pre-Vedic time. What we have is the Vedic period itself was very much immersed in nature, and their perception itself was very universal. So when we read ancient prayers, where ancient mantras, where they are seeing conscious powers behind nature, and it was not superstitious belief or fear in these godheads, but behind the physical they saw the godheads, the divine powers, and which is, we can see across the world, the perception of nature as a conscious being is very universal. And it is later, as the mind began, the intellectual development began, that connection was lost. And then, as I was saying, the descending curve. So Vedic period had that profound immersion in nature. Prithavi Sasya Shalini. And also their invocation of peace, when we look at Dhyau Shanti, Antariksham Shanti, Prithavi Shanti, Abas Shanti, Oshadaya Shanti, Vanaspadaya Shanti, Vishwe Deva Shanti, Brahma Shanti, Sarvam Shanti, Shanti Reva Shanti. The vastness of the perception, the vastness of the heart, seeing things way beyond me, the human little thing. In fact, human beings are not even there in the story. It's the amazing totality of the universe around where peace is invoked. Reconnect to that. And this is where Sri Aurobindo brings in the synthesis, where science is seeing forces of nature as mechanical. They are deriving the forces of nature. There is an intuition in science that all forces can be resolved into a single force. But science is still struggling to get the relationship between consciousness and force. And this is where Sri Aurobindo synthesizes this as Chit Shakti, conscious force. If we approach forces of nature as conscious, we can relate to them as conscious, and they reveal as conscious. If we approach them as mechanical, they appear as mechanical. And this is something very fundamental to understand force. At a material level, there is a mechanization, and as it gets more and more refined, as the evolution unfolds, force becomes conscious. We become self-aware, self-conscious force. But we can open to higher forces that are spiritual in nature. So that conscious invocation and connection, and nature, outer nature as well as inner nature, a seamless integration of the two. This is where the whole new science is to emerge. And Tantra has explored, and Sri Aurobindo saw Tantra as a great synthesis and he gives it a great importance. But his approach to Tantra was very different. His process begins with Vedanta and enters Tantra. And in Tantra, the opening of the centers of energy and consciousness is from bottom up, whereas he is bringing in what is descending from above and transforming. And we are, like at present, as a civilization with godlike technology, medieval institutions, and Paleolithic emotions. And that is the condition as of now. And transformation of this requires something greater than the mind, and that is a descending force. And that is what symbolically captured in Matrimandir, right at the center of all of us. This Tantra is different, and so phase one of integral yoga is Vedantic, then it becomes Tantric, and then it goes beyond that into a whole new domain.